Well, maybe we will start. How about that?
Uh,
People will be joining in. I'm sure Lukasz Siegel is ready to let in other
oh,
participants. So this is a very special event. Uh, we are not people who are fond of Zoom lectures, but it's not a teaser, but it's a preview. Because this is a regular lecture, but it's a preview to other three lectures that Howie Firth will deliver in Bratislava, and I'm so glad that four of our students, Valery Bartek, Max Fotios, and then Anna Piskalikova are here. So those will be your students, and then they also got an extended description of your course. So you will be talking to them on and off the lectures. I'm sure they would be delighted to talk to you outside of the classes. And this is not an ordinary lecture. This is a part of an event that with our Slovenian colleagues we are trying to start. And I'm glad that Andras Ivšek is here, a philosopher from Kopar and Ljubljana. We are trying to start a movement called Second Renaissance or a New Renaissance, and meaning that we want to discuss issues that would start something that 15th century has started in Europe and it changed the face of Earth. Whether we will succeed, I don't know. But what we thought that we would offer maybe 20, 30 scholars from around Europe or around the world who would offer this kind of lecture. So we'll have a 20, 30s online lectures, and schools or institutions that would be interested, then we invite those scholars, as we do now, invite Howie Firth to Bratislava. So we'll see how we succeed with that. I'm so delighted that Howie has accepted the invitation, because he's a physicist, but mainly to us and then our Slovenian colleagues, he's a Renaissance man. You can see the books. I'm sure maybe just 1/5 of it is about sciences. It's about everything, and he organizes this wonderful science festival at Orkney, Scotland, apparently a beautiful islands off Scottish coast, and where he lives, and he was discussing this topic that he is going to talk about, and I thought it would be a pity not to share it with him. And what I'm delighted that as we exchange our ideas about the lecture, he has his work on it and then expanded and then changed it, and then actually the last lecture will be about contemporary situation, which is not always easy when you talk about history, science, philosophy, but he has somehow managed, and in the fourth lecture will be dealing with that. But Howie, here you are. This is your recorded lecture, and then we will have a discussion. So Howie, please take over.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Samuel, for that kind welcome, and thank you very much, everyone. And I will just share the screen here and hope that I'm clicking the right things that I ought to be clicking. And all being well, we should see a picture, a nice wintry picture, which actually came from Scotland. But I'm going to go back 400 and more years to the story of René Descartes, who had such weak health in childhood that his school let him stay in bed late in the mornings. And at that time, no one would ever have thought that he was going to change the way we think about the world, or that he was going to join the army. He did both. His health, he says, he inherited from his mother, who died not long after his birth in 1596. His father took little interest in him and left him with his grandmother. A dry cough and a pale colour stayed until he was more than 20. But I have always had an inclination to look at things from the most favourable angle. and to make my principal happiness depend upon myself alone. And I think that this inclination caused the indisposition, which was almost part of my nature, to disappear. Well, at the age of 10, he went here as a boarder to the Jesuit school of La Flèche. The Jesuits were the intellectual arm of the Counter-Reformation, and their aim was to produce highly trained and motivated leaders for society. La Flèche taught not only the classics, the works of the Greeks and the Romans, but also practical skills for life. Students learned to ride a horse and to use a sword and to swim too. They studied theatre and ballet and mathematics and astronomy. And in 1611, they had a celebration to mark Galileo's discovery of the moons of Jupiter. The young Descartes found he loved mathematics, but he took a deep dislike to philosophy. The subject spanned a whole range of areas of thought that today would be separate disciplines, from physics, natural philosophy, as it was called, from physics to ethics. The texts of the ancient Greeks were regarded as the essential sources of knowledge. Research involved close study of the standard texts and debate as to what the ancients might or might not have meant when they wrote it. The teachings of Aristotle had a fundamental distinction between the heavens and the earth. The world down here on the earth was flawed and corruptible, but the heavens were perfect. On that basis, the motions of each planet in the sky had to be in a circle, because the circle was seen as the most perfect geometrical figure. They just had to be in circles, carried around on transparent spheres. As to what made them move, it had to be some intrinsic nature or soul. But of course, people then could observe the planets in the sky as we do now, and they could see that obviously the planets' paths are wiggles or loops, not circles. But back in the 2nd century AD, an astronomer and mathematician in the Egyptian city of Alexandria came up with a way to build the motion of the planets out of circles. His name was Ptolemy, and his background seems to have been a mixture of Greek and Roman. Ptolemy worked out a system with each planet moving in a circle, and then the center of this circle moved in turn round the circumference of another circle. You can see in the picture, here's Jupiter moving in a circle round a central point, and this central point is then also moving in a circle around the Earth. Now, the system was extremely complicated, but it gave you a lot of options. You could choose the size of each of those two circles, and if you did that, you could manage to fit the motion of each planet. So circles continued to be at the heart of the heavens. Now, also in Aristotle's universe, everything had to achieve its potential. It was rather like the acorn achieves its outcome as an oak tree. So in Aristotle's world, when an apple falls, the motion is due to elements within it, earth and water, seeking out their origins in the heavy earth, almost as if they're cold, and the heavy earth is the center of a universe around which the heavens rotate. Well, Descartes liked the Jesuits, he liked the teaching at La Flèche, but he did not think that the study of philosophy was going to take him very far. When I saw that it had been cultivated for many ages by the most distinguished men, and that yet there is not a single matter within its sphere which is not still in dispute, and nothing therefore which is above doubt, I did not presume to anticipate that my success would be greater in it than that of others. And that is why, as soon as my age permitted me to quit my preceptors, I entirely gave up the study of letters, and resolving to seek no other science than that which I could find in myself or the great book of the world, I employed the remainder of my youth in travel, in seeing courts and camps, in frequenting people of diverse humours and conditions, in collecting varied experience, and above all, in endeavouring to draw profitable reflection from what I saw. For it seemed to me that I should meet with more truth in the reasonings which each man makes in his own affairs, and which, if wrong, would be speedily punished by failure, than in those reasonings which the philosopher makes in his study. Well, this was a bold way to seek the truth. He would observe what people did when their lives depended on the outcome. So off he went to join the army. This was a time when Central Europe was gradually drifting into the series of bitter political and religious conflicts which formed the terrible 30 Years' War. One potential flashpoint was Holland, where the Spanish, driven out by the Protestant Dutch, seemed likely to try to come back. So Descartes set off to become a gentleman volunteer in the army of Prince Maurice of Nassau in the city of Breda. Prince Maurice was the foremost general of the time. He'd studied military history, strategy and tactics. He'd studied mathematics and astronomy too. He trained his soldiers and indeed laid the foundations for a modern professional army. He brought in skilled people to help with the training, among them the Flemish mathematician Simon Stevin, whose practical knowledge ranged from hydraulic engineering to accounting. And there in Breda, Descartes met another mathematician. Isaac Bakeman had studied theology and medicine, but he'd also spent time in his father's trade, laying water pipes and channels for breweries. The practical approach to problems was a Dutch tradition. Bakeman dealt with mechanical processes by building them up step by step from small foundations. And he believed that you could apply that same method to the world in general, build it up in a model piece by piece. He was also thinking deeply about the nature of motion and the problem of why the apple falls. He didn't believe in Aristotle's picture of the apple seeking out a state of rest on the ground. He argued instead that the earth was somehow attracting it. Well, the Dutchman, Bakeman, and the Frenchman, Descartes, struck up a friendship. For a start, they were, noted Bakeman in his diary, the only two people in Breda to speak Latin. But also, he remarked, Descartes says he has never met anyone other than myself who pursues his studies in the way I do, combining physics and mathematics in an exact way. And for my part, I have never spoken with anyone apart from him who studies in this way. Descartes said, "You are indeed the one person who has shaken me out of my nonchalance and made me remember what I had learned and almost forgotten. When my mind strayed far from serious concerns, it was you who guided it back down the correct path." And by now, Descartes was on the road again. War was coming, not in Holland, but in Bohemia. Its Protestant nobles were taking an increasingly independent line towards their Catholic rulers in the Holy Roman Empire. In the spring of 1619, the old Emperor Matthias died, and his designated successor, Ferdinand, was known for strongly upholding Catholic teachings in church and state. A head-on confrontation was on the way, and Descartes set off to follow events. It was on the 20th of March that the old emperor died, and we find Descartes writing 6 days later to Bakeman with his travel plans. He speaks of dangers on the road with rumours of war and many men under arms. The direct route to Bohemia will be too risky, he says, so he will take a very roundabout way through Amsterdam and Poland, Hungary, Austria. But there's a feeling of adventure about it all, like Virgil's Aeneas, who wandered after the sack of Troy. He says he no longer knows where destiny will lead me or where it will bring me to rest. And amidst it all, his mathematics was flourishing. The same letter shows how he was building himself up to taking on a big challenge involving the role of mathematics. What I would like to present to the public is a science with wholly new foundations, which will enable us to answer every question that can be put about any kind of each according to its quantity, whatever, whether continuous or discontinuous nature. The task is infinite and could not be accomplished by one person. It is as incredible as it is ambitious. But I have seen a certain light in the dark chaos of this science, thanks to which the thickest clouds can be dispelled. By the summer of 1619, he was in Frankfurt, witnessing the preparations for the coronation of Ferdinand as Holy Roman Emperor. As the year went on, the storm clouds over Bohemia darkened. In August, the Protestant nobles decided to confront the empire. They rejected Ferdinand as their ruler. They offered the crown instead to a Protestant, Frederick, who ruled the area west of the Rhine called the Palatinate. That decision was to have terrible consequences. The empire made ready to crush the rebellion, and in October, Duke Maximilian of Bavaria agreed to deploy his troops against the Bohemians. Descartes planned to join Maximilian's forces, but his journey to Bohemia was broken by the onset of winter. Now, at this time, the winters were terrible because this was the time called the Little Ice Age, and you can see some of the images from the time. Here's a winter landscape with ice skaters from a Dutch painter. And at that time, rivers would froze, lakes would freeze. Here's a winter ski scene with skaters near a castle. And here's another scene by the same Dutch painter. And you can see this is almost exactly about the time of Descartes. This one, 1615, just 4 years before the year of Descartes' journey in 1619. Descartes reached Ulm, which is strategically situated by the road between Frankfurt and Vienna. And by the time he had reached there, the weather had really broken. He took up his quarters in a nearby village. And there, staying in the warmth and the stillness, out of the harshness of the snow and ice, he made a breakthrough which was to lay the foundations for our whole modern scientific worldview. In his winter quarters, he found himself in a room by a warm stove. The cold winter had begun to bite, snow and ice were closing down activity, and a still and solitary mood began to take him. Having neither conversation to divert me, nor, fortunately, cares or passion to trouble me, I was completely free to consider my own thoughts, he says. The strange mood grew, and on the 10th of November, he had a daytime vision and 3 dreams, and the way ahead became clear. In the first dream, he was whirled around in a tempest. In the second dream, there was the sound of thunder and sparks of fire in the room around him. His third dream began with a book, and then he read the words of the Roman poet Ausonius. Quod vitae sectabor iter, which road, which path, which road in life shall I follow? And the pieces of his thinking came together. First of all, he said, reason has to be the key to knowledge. The knowledge of his time was formed from a mix of postulates and concepts and opinions that had come from a range of different people. It was like a structure built by many different craftsmen. It lacked the overall clarity of something visioned and shaped by one person alone. And, said Descartes, it never comes as close to the truth as the simple reasoning which a man of good sense naturally makes concerning whatever he comes across. So, he thought, the only way to move forward was to get rid of the whole clutter, clear it away, start again using the very minimum of assumptions, to start with principles alone. And here they are. The first, he says, never accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such. The second, to divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible, and as might be necessary for its adequate solution. The third, to conduct my thoughts in such order that by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I might ascend by little, and, as it were, step by step, to the knowledge of the more complex. And the last, in every case to make enumeration so complete and reviews so general that I might be assured that nothing was omitted. You can see the influence here of the practical approach of Isaac Bateman, the man who he'd met in the city of Breda, the very practical man who built things up piece by piece. That's what Descartes is doing, building up the whole of knowledge in the same solid way. My design was singly to find ground of assurance and cast aside the loose earth and sand, that I might reach the rock or the clay. So we've got the method. How to apply it? Well, the first thing he says, the first thing that we can be absolutely sure of is that we exist. We could imagine the world not to exist, but not the other way round. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. We can, he says, draw a boundary line between the mind and the body. Our whole essence or nature consists only in thinking. It has no need of place, nor is dependent on any material thing. He sees the mind as wholly distinct from the body and able to continue in existence on its own. Well, this is a lonely thought of winter stillness, but it has a practical consequence. If we are in here and are trying to form a picture of the world out there, what kind of data from that world can we be absolutely sure of, given that so much can be the subject of illusion or debate? Descartes' answer is that there is only one type of information of which we can all be sure: location. We can agree on where objects are, on their size, and where they're moving to. These are the hard, irreducible facts of existence. All else risks coloration by sense impressions. The story is that while sitting by the stove, he saw a fly stirred into life by the heat. As the fly drifted back and forth, the question formed in his mind, what could we know for sure about it? We couldn't know what the fly was thinking, or indeed if the fly is actually thinking. We can only be sure of the fly's position. So at any moment, we specify the fly's distance from the wall on our left, and then its distance from the wall behind us. We specify the fly's height. Those three numbers give us the hard facts about the fly at that time. We call them the fly's coordinates. And with the two walls at right angles and the floor, we have a coordinate system in 3 dimensions. And there is one there with a few extra numbers. That's a coordinate system in 2 dimensions. And you can take it up, of course, to 3. We can look at how the fly's coordinates are changing, put in numbers at any time for its position. We can follow its motion along the coordinate path. All we have is numbers. So we've switched from a sense-based picture of the world to a mathematical one. Descartes has pulled us back from an involvement in the world. He's looking out on it as if through a window. He's pared down all its richness and complexity into just one basic, simple and sure aspect: location, expressed by numbers. But now this is exactly what happens when we look up in the skies, and particularly through a telescope. We see points of light in the sky. We can't touch them or travel among them. All we know is their location, expressed in numbers. So now we've got an equivalence between the earth where we stand and the heavens above us. Each territory can be expressed in terms of location and numbers. We look out at the earth, we express what we see in numbers. We look up at the sky, we express what we see with numbers. And you see, at a stroke, he's removed the separation of the heavens and the earth. The motion of stars and planets above can now be specified by the same types of numbers as the motion of flies or horses here on the earth. In his book, The World, started in 1630 but only published after his death, Descartes sets out a picture of the universe, stretching out to infinity in all directions. He has unified nature into a single universe of matter, which moves according to fixed laws. Give me extension and motion, and I will construct the world, he says. His system of coordinates to specify location forms a grid. It looks a bit like a net or a web. And we can find nets and webs in varied places. For instance, in Greek mythology, we hear how the god Hephaestus found his wife Aphrodite in bed with the god Ares, and he constructed a great net to trap them there so that he could bring the other residents of Olympus to see and shame them. For the Greeks, the gods and goddesses in the heavens were powerful enough to drive planets on their courses through the otherwise uniformly turning field of stars. And indeed, Aphrodite is associated with the planet Venus and Ares with Mars. Descartes constructed a giant net to reach up from the earth to the skies to fill the whole universe, and with it to cover everything. So the heavens and earth are now unified into this universe of matter. And this is what opened the way for Sir Isaac Newton to develop the concept of gravitation as the source of the force moving the planets in orbit around the sun. Descartes had built a picture in which both the heavens above and the earth below were made of the same stuff. This meant that we could look at the motion of objects down here on Earth and apply our experience of them to the motion of planets up there in the sky. So Newton could take Galileo's work on motion on Earth and apply it to Kepler's discovery about the motion of the planets. And that's why Newton called his great work Principia Mathematica, in tribute to Descartes' own work, Principia Philosophiae. Newton's work, The Principles of Mathematics; Descartes' work, The Principles of Philosophy. So Descartes gave us a universe of matter, but there was a price to pay. He left us within ourselves looking out at the world. But yet we know in practice that our thinking is influenced by the body. A climb in the mountains and the sharp smell of the air will help us think more clearly. And if Descartes must have known that. He would have been familiar with the feeling of the wind and sleet on his face on a dark winter's day, the water soaking into his cloak, and his horse plodding along a slippery, muddy road. And then the light of an inn and the warmth of a seat by the open fire, a glass of schnapps and a bowl of hot soup, as the evening opens up with stories from other travellers and a song or two. In fact, after loneliness in childhood, the richness of life on the road must have meant a lot to him. So the separation of the mind from the body was not necessarily something that followed his own feelings, his own desires. A strong argument for his reasoning has been put forward in recent years by Leonard Schlein in his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. Schlein points out that the Europe of Descartes' time had a mixed bag of religious beliefs, which often were used to justify horrific violence in the crazed hunt for witches and in the savagery of the fighting between Catholic and Protestant states in the 30 Years' War. He highlights the significance of Descartes' first step. Throughout most of Europe, Protestants were congregating in whitewashed churches, repeating over and over again the mantra of Luther and Calvin, faith, faith, faith. For Catholics, the operative word was believe, believe, believe. Uttering the single word that would reverberate over the next 4 centuries, Descartes exclaimed, doubt. This word was the gauntlet thrown down by the scientific age. So, says Schlein, by going on to split mind from body, Descartes was ultimately separating religion from science. Now, we can think of the consequences. If you mix the world of mind and matter, as they did in medieval times, then if the milk turns sour, you might wonder if it could be something to do with the attitude of the old woman down the road who you argued with when her cows broke into your field. But if the line is drawn between mind and matter, then you simply look at the milk or the milk jug or your own cows for a solution. In other words, when you have a material problem, you seek a material solution. Leonard Schlein, who was a surgeon as well as a writer, highlighted the importance of what Descartes did by separating mind and matter. This extensive, invasive surgery was necessary to stop the madness that was destroying the body politic of 17th century Europe. Due in large part to Descartes and the scientific method he championed, over the next century, the witch hunts slowly abated and became a disturbing, repressed cultural memory. The religious war between Catholics and Protestants petered out, but lay smouldering like a root fire capable of flaring up even after it seems to have been extinguished. But Schlein recognizes there was a price to pay for the success of the new matter-based science. Science dismissed spirituality, disdained discussions of ethics and philosophy, and demonstrated a disturbing tendency to ally itself with contemporary hunter-killers, the military. Still, science was a significant improvement over the superstitious thought systems that had generated the witch craze atrocities. It took time for Descartes to give final shape to his great vision of the German winter of 1619. In fact, it was only when he settled in Holland in the autumn of 1628 that he began to find the quietness to collect his thoughts and pursue his studies to the fullest. He spent much of the rest of his life and probably his happiest years in that country. He developed his ideas about physics and mathematics and philosophy while continuing his practice of rising late, taking regular morning walks, and keeping a well-stocked vegetable garden. And at The Hague, in those final happy years, he met Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. Her father had been the Elector Palatine Frederick, whose acceptance of the throne of Bohemia had started the 30 Years' War. Her mother, also called Elizabeth, was the sister of the English monarch Charles I, and her brother was the dashing Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Princess Elizabeth's parents had lasted just one winter in Bohemia, and people called them the Winter King and Queen. The relationship between the princess and the philosopher was very close. He dedicated his principles of philosophy to her as one of the few people who could really understand his writings. Even among the best and most cultivated minds, there are many who find my writings very obscure, and nearly always those who are familiar with mathematics cannot comprehend metaphysics, while those conversant with metaphysics cannot understand mathematics. The only mind, as far as my experience goes, to which both alike are easy is yours, and so I am compelled to regard it as incomparable. They were clearly very close. They wrote long letters. They discussed thinkers from Socrates to Machiavelli. They discussed the nature of the passions that range from joy to sadness. The difference in their ages, in their religions, and in their social status would have meant that anything beyond this was impossible. One day in 1646, her family took her away from Holland, and she and Descartes never saw each other again. But in the September of 1649, he left Holland, the court of Queen Christina of Sweden. It was an astonishing direction for his life to take, and it proved a fatal one. Queen Christina was the daughter of King Gustav Adolf, the bulwark of Protestantism in the north, who had invaded Germany in the 30 Years' War and for a time driven back the forces of the Catholic Bavarians. But he died in 1632 among the smoke and ruin of the battlefield of Lutzen. His very young daughter had succeeded to the throne of Sweden and been trained up by her father's ministers to take over where he left off when she reached the age of 18. But when she was old enough to rule in her own right, Queen Christina turned out to be very different from everyone's expectations. He who follows his own path needs no map, she said. She preferred art and science to politics, and she encouraged education and trade and manufacturing. She gave titles to so many people that Sweden today still has many barons and counts from her time. She didn't see the point of carrying on the 30 Years' War, which she thought had gone on long enough, and she looked for suitable concessions to end it. She finally abdicated in favour of her cousin and left the country in man's clothes and went to live in Rome as a Catholic. But while Christina ruled Sweden, she was determined that scholarship would flourish, and that it should flourish in her way. In the case of Descartes, this entailed him giving her 5-hour lessons in philosophy 3 days a week at 5 o'clock in the morning. The hours and the northern winter proved too much for his health, and he died on February the 11th, 1650. As to why he went to Sweden, which he called a land of bears and ice and rocks, we can only speculate. We may note that Queen Christina liked to create new noblemen. We may also note that Princess Elizabeth was friendly with Christina's mother and had considered making a trip to Sweden with her. And we may note that the princess never married, but entered the church and became an abbess in Westphalia, and eventually died 30 years after Descartes, on the exact same day of the year, February the 11th. But out in the winter snow and darkness, Descartes had lit a new light, a light which helped on the one hand to gradually damp down the witch craze, and on the other hand to shine a path for the development of the whole of modern science, indeed for much of modern thought. More than 2 centuries later, the American poet and philosopher Henry Thoreau, living in the cabin he had built on the shore of Walden Pond, thought that the stillness and coldness of winter tended to concentrate thinking. The winter, he said, is thrown to us like a bone to a famishing dog, and we are expected to get the marrow out of it. The peoples of the Arctic know that sometimes an individual may have to go out onto the ice on their own to develop greater vision. And out of the ice and snow of a northern winter, Descartes developed a great vision and lit a lamp for a new spring. But remember that surgical cut he made, which we will come back to, and remember that ancient division made by the Greeks between earth and sky that lasted for 2,000 years. And that leads to the big question of how it came about, a question that we will find takes us to some unexpected places.
Thank you very much, Howie. That's wonderful. Yes, well, what a story, what a journey in the winter of those many countries and in the middle ice age that he experienced. So please, ladies and gentlemen, students, if you have any comments, questions, I'm sure Howie would be happy to answer.
If I may, I have a question, a bit collaboration on the quote. It was on one of the presentation slides, on the famous quote, the cogito ergo sum, and when Descartes, from what I understand, saying that the thinking doesn't depend on the place, and nor is dependent on any much material thing. If you can again elaborate on what he means by the thinking doesn't depend on any material thing.
Yes, that's a good question. You see, he's saying, remember, he's saying we build up knowledge piece by piece, and we only start with what we can be absolutely sure of. Well, even the world about us, we can't be absolutely sure of. And indeed, you could imagine, people sometimes talk about, is the world illusory? The one thing we can be absolutely sure of, the one thing I can be absolutely sure of is that I am me. And that's the very starting point. Now, I then can say, well, the world out there, I might be looking at it, and actually with sense perception, we have various optical illusions, for example, with our eyes. And it's various people, psychologists have shown that sometimes what we think we see is not actually what we see. So in a modern sense, we could say that's true. The world out there is not as absolutely sure as it could be. It's 99.9999% sure. But if we want to start with something that we're absolutely sure of, it's our own personal existence. So, and also Descartes says we could imagine the world vanishing, but we couldn't imagining me vanishing, if me vanishing means the end of everything. So in other words, I'm the starting point, and then I build up this picture of the world.
Thank you very much. It's now making more sense for me. Thank you.
It's just to say, it's this idea of building up knowledge piece by piece. It's almost like a builder, puts bricks into a wall, and eventually the wall, or actually a medieval craftsman might build a cathedral. That spire on the cathedral stands on these very small foundations. And it's this very practical way that people like Isaac Bateman built the world, used to building systems for water to flow in breweries. So Descartes is building in this very practical way.
For me, it was just one thing that from, I guess, our times and our philosophy, that material world is the major aspect that is shaping our perception. So for me, it was a bit challenging to understand it at first.
That actually is a very good point. It's actually a point we're going to be coming on in the series, and as Samuel mentioned, the final talk, we're going to come back, because in the final talk we're actually going to look at the consequences of this line between mind and matter, between me inside and the world outside. And what has happened in the modern scientific worldview, it's built so much out of matter. In one way, Descartes was almost too successful, because he joined the heavens and the earth into a universe of matter that mind didn't affect. And then you could gradually build up the rules of matter in a material world. But what has happened in science, of course, is that it's everything it tries to build up out of matter. And then you get questions. scientific debate about consciousness. Does consciousness come about? Is it an inevitable result of matter? And indeed, is life an inevitable result? And the assumption made by quite a lot of scientists, if you stick atoms together and then you stick atoms into molecules, and you build up molecules into chemicals into cells, and you keep going, that somehow at some stage it will become alive. You put the pieces together and suddenly it becomes alive, and then suddenly at another stage it becomes conscious. And that's so built, it's actually built into our thinking. But Descartes was at the start of it, when you could, and he was thinking very much of mind, not of mind as being up of matter, being built up of matter, but he was just thinking of mind as he was ruling it out completely. And he was saying, in one way, I almost wondered if he was saying, build up your world out of matter, and when the time's right, come back and see if you can add anything with mind.
Now I see the argument why consciousness is it's a singular, the most important thing. It's kind of over the material thing, over the body, like one of the strongest arguments from my heart. So thank you.
Yeah, yes, I do agree. I do agree that and I'll be bringing this into the final one, very much saying that there's much more to consciousness than just sticking together pieces of matter. So thank you for the question.
Okay. More questions or comments?
Can I ask a question? Thanks for that, Howie. I'm looking forward to the series here. It's going to be, I can tell it's going to be very stimulating. I'm curious actually about the second brick in the structure. I'm wondering if you have a sense of why location is so significant. I've always loved Descartes' argument for the necessity of affirming the existence of mind. But it creates this big problem of how you ever get anything outside of mind, how you get a next step. And at least in the meditations, it's a big issue, and he ends up using some ontological arguments, and then this whole picture of God as not being a deceiver. You have a sort of a shortcut here, and I think I'd never really thought about it as so significant, especially for his Cartesian plane and all this, that we can be certain of the location of an object and then build everything out of that. But why that? How does he get that certainty, the location? Do you have a sense of that?
This is a very interesting question. I think that a lot was happening in the sense of space in Europe of that time, because in a way, space is not a fundamental of our experience of the world. It's time. So, for instance, if I go on a journey, what matters is the time on a journey. Now, particularly if I'm walking, if there are two journeys to go on, and one is on a flat level road and the other is on a heathery hillside, the physical fact that both journeys are actually a kilometer isn't important to me. All that matters is one, I can do it in 15 minutes, but the other is a hard slog and it'll take 30 minutes. So in fact, an idea that we make space as something uniform and something significant and building on it isn't so natural. But you do see space beginning to build up in various ways. You see it in the Dutch painters, for example. You see it in the development of perspective, for example, this very precise look at space. And you also see it in the development of the theatre of the time. There's one interesting development happening around that time. It happened in England at the time of King James the Sixth and First, who died in 1625, exactly 400 years ago. He developed the theatre, and in the theatre, there's a kind of geometrical shape because you've got the stage there and you've got this perspective from the audience and ultimately the king watching in the audience. Now, one theory about why King James particularly developed the theatre is that he was a king from Scotland and he'd come to rule England. At that time, when you spoke of a king of a country, you meant the king of the people. So the king ruled the people who accepted his law, not so much a physical landscape, but in the plays, in the Shakespearean theatre, landscape was very much emphasized. And the idea was that you move the perception of King James as being a king of people, in which case you'd think of him as Scottish, to being king of Britain, a physical landscape. So the argument by this man, whose name is Kenneth Olwig, it's at Trondheim University in Norway, his argument is that space, there was a movement, the theatre was helping a movement from a people-focused picture of the world to more of a space-focused picture of the world. And this opens up all kinds of questions about this shifting perception of space. And actually, this opens up a lot of interesting questions, I think, for further study.
Yeah, that's quite a different sort of argument from what I would expect from Descartes if he's proceeding by sort of clear, logical, certain steps to bring in this sort of way people are discoursing at the time.
Oh, I wasn't suggesting that Descartes was involved in that. What I was meaning is that there was shifting, there was perception shifting and people's experience. I mean, I could think of another example why Descartes would think of space as important. He would see artillery. I'm sure he would see shooting and artillery practiced in the army. Prince Maurice trained them, the mathematician Simon Stevin trained them on laying sieges. So there would be it would be very much a kind of geometrical setting. And this is more of a feeling I have, but I just feel that there's a shifting perception of space. So the idea of so space becomes more important, and the idea you think of space as more important than in previous times.
Thank you.
Yeah.
May I ask you? You mentioned that well, science kind of push out philosophy, spirituality, and ethics, and of course Descartes was a philosopher, was in a Jesuit school. Was he aware of this? Was he aware that he's starting something that might lead to this, or this was not on his radar?
That's a very good question. I don't think it was, because he was you could see from his life, he was a warm human being. It's true that people have spoken about his attitude to animals, but in fact he didn't complete all his work. He was going to write more about animals. I think, as Leonard Schlein says, the witch craze was just the most terrible thing. And also this idea of mind, this lack of philosophical discipline in argument, it meant that he really wanted something that was absolutely clean cut and logical and rigid. So it was a price to put mind. And actually, I think both Princess Elizabeth and Queen Christina raised this as a question. They said to him, look, if you cut mind from matter, which means body, how does mind then affect body? And I don't know if he actually had all that good an answer to it. But I think it was, like Schlein says, I think it was necessary surgery. It was desperately urgent because medieval Europe was really floundering around, you know, in this so many circular arguments. On the one hand, going to the books of the ancients and finding a quote or a phrase in it. And then also you had these attributing, you know, the attributions to any material effect in the world. You said, oh, somebody did this, or so I think that it was a necessary thing rather than a wish.
Well, it's a pity that Professor Newell is not here, but I'm sure he'll watch it. And in his book, he actually has a very interesting argument that, you know, the ancients had the Ptolemaic science, which had no problem to include spirituality or ethics because God were part of the universe. Whereas modern science has completely ruled that out. And the whole edifice of ancient philosophy and outlook has falling apart, although we try to recover the Greek philosophy, Greek ethics, and then somehow we believe that it can stand on its own, but without, Professor Newell argues, without that cosmology, without that physics, which is totally unacceptable to modern science, it's impossible. And he says that, well, our attempt is to turn from the Ptolemaic physics to history, but that's not very reliable method to continue. It's interesting that, you know, you get science, a perfect science, you separate mind from body, and then what you get is almost like the Catholics you mentioned, that in ethics and morality you just believe, and no longer is there any solid ground for that.
Well, this is a very good point, and I'm looking forward, as we mentioned, to the final one when there's really an opportunity to show that this needs to be rethought, because what's happening is we're seeing in the world a build-up of problems because the very success of science dealing with the material world has led many scientists to go further and further and further and into territory that you clearly where there are clear problems. Now there are technical problems emerging within science, and there are problems within science and society, because indeed, how can you have people handling the kind of things like creating nuclear weapons, for example, who don't actually have who haven't got built into their philosophy equally strongly ethics and morality? I mean, it's even for self-survival. It's necessary. So, and it's interesting that in this state, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Ilya Prigogine says it's no coincidence that we've got two crises at the same time: a crisis in science itself with really big technical challenges, and a crisis in society. And this separation is we're now seeing. It's 400 years science has developed on the basis of this, but we're coming to a stage where the problems are building up, and actually the problems, I think you could almost say, are building up for science in the same way that they built up for the medieval church. And there's quite a parallel between science in terms of the sheer size of it. It's very much like the medieval church, the structure of it, the rigidity with which you can have doctrines. There are so many parallels, and so this is why I think that this cut that Descartes made. First of all, it's so important to focus on it, to really understand the significance, because I think to many scientists today, they are not really consciously aware of it. In other words, they could, it's easy if you're studying science to assume that that's all there is to it, rather than the fact that somebody did this act deliberately and shaped thinking and perception from then until the present day.
Okay, wow, that's very, very disconcerting, actually. Yes, please. Anybody would like to? Photios, please.
Yeah, no, I don't have. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very enjoyable, and it has a great literary value as well. I think it's very paints a picture, which is nice. Yeah, maybe just to continue, I guess I am looking forward for all the lectures, especially the fourth one, because it's very true. I think today's world is really facing these extremes. There is crude materialism on the one side. On the other side, there is this, ascent into, or descent rather, into prejudice. And science and religion as two bodies seem to not be able to come together and kind of offer a coherent worldview or something. And it is alarming. And I'm just thinking, this separation of earth and sky, and really my knowledge is very very limited. I don't know, but like I'm thinking of the Greeks, or I'm even thinking of the golden age of Islam. And I'm thinking that, of course, the two were quite connected, but it's not that one was ruling the other, right? It's not necessarily that the sky was ruling the earth in a very strict sense. Of course, there is a descendancy or something, but still we can examine the two as separate. So how helpful has it been that they have been separated so much? And did Descartes really want to separate them to such a point that they're seen almost as two separate things that cannot really seem to work together? I don't know.
Oh, that's a wonderful question, and I'll be coming into that because the next one I'm going to look at a number of aspects of this separation, and then in the third talk I'll look at aims to bring them back together again. But it's worth saying that not everybody separated earth and sky, and so, for instance, if we go back to the Neolithic, or even further back to older hunter-gatherer cultures, they picture the universe as a single unit. They actually often pictured the universe as the body of a live cosmic figure. I mean, you might say god or goddess, but it's just the word of a cosmic figure. Now, there's a whole range of cosmologies like that, but then there are also cosmologies in which the universe is formed when a live figure is killed and the pieces of the live figure are assembled. Again, I'm anticipating, but in the Babylonian, there's a creation story where the sky god, Marduk, attacks the goddess of the sea called Tiamat. And Marduk fires everything, all the force of the storm, thunder, lightning, kills Tiamat, and then he slices her body in two. And then the one part of the body he makes into the sky, and then the lower part of the body he makes into the earth. Now, in one way, of course, in terms of separation in earth and sky, it's interesting because it's suggesting that something happened to separate earth and sky. On the other hand, at least earth and sky were made out of this common material. And what's interesting also in that, in terms of what we talked about matter, is that model, you actually have a live universe. You actually have life as a fundamental feature of a universe, and then something happens and it becomes dead. So in different cultures, you have these different attitudes to earth and sky. And again, I can anticipate a bit, but Plato and Aristotle had this great debate about earth and sky, and I think they were responsible for some of the separation, or there's more to it, because the early Greek philosophers, the very early Greek philosophers from about 600 or so onwards, they were saying things like the whole universe is made essentially of water, or it's made of something that they called the infinite. And then Plato and Socrates had the debate about form and substance. And the idea was the universe is made out of prime matter, as they would call it, made out of something. But then what's things made out of? Well, things are made out of when we aggregate the prime matter, almost like pottery. You shape, you mold the things. So the question is then, which is more important, the substance of which things are made of, or the way they're formed? And that was this big debate between Plato and Aristotle. Plato argued that form was more important, and Aristotle argued substance. Now, Plato was thinking of mathematics in particular. He associated with mathematics and form as the sky. And Aristotle was thinking of substance, because Aristotle said, you've got to have substance first before you can see form. He gave the example of snub noses. And he said, look, before you can have a concept of a snub nose, you have to have a nose. So he said substance. So this argument between the two of them about earth and sky was part of it. And that then Aristotle's picture, this very earthy kind of picture, then led actually to ideas about atoms. So substance, and of course, in our modern world, substance, like in science, substance and matter are primary rather than form.
Okay, thank you. Any other comment or question? Okay, if not, Howie, thank you very much. We are really looking forward to the discussions, that I can see that both the discussion lectures and especially the discussion afterwards will be very fruitful, because there is so much to debate. Lawrence, who asked the question, he's a philosopher as well, and so he knows much about Plato and Aristotle, and we will discuss that more. So with that, thanks a lot for all of you, and looking forward to seeing you in Bratislava, and then of course your lecture will be put on YouTube tomorrow, and so we'll send you a link.